Action Plan. As you can probably hear from the announcement, we're going to be recording this evening to be able to post it on the city channels, which is very exciting. So thank you for joining us this evening. The first activity that we're going to get started with is a live poll that we have here. And if you'd like to take out your phone, if you have one, you can actually scan or use your camera to do a screenshot of the QR code that is in front of you here to ask the first polling question that we're going to offer for this evening. And if you're also joining us on the Zoom call, in the Q&A and in the chat function rather, there is the ability to actually click on that link and join the poll that we have here as well. So we'll give folks a few seconds to be able to join that. And then what we'll do is, Jill, if you want to go to the next slide here, we'll actually show you the question that's in this poll. And if you didn't have a chance to capture that with your phone, you can also go to www.menti.com. And when you're there, if you put in the code 89792264, you'll be able to join this exact same poll in the fashion that we have here as well. So at any point in time, you can answer this question. And we thought we'd get the evening started by asking you, what is your favorite thing about using or having transit in Malden? And what will happen here as people enter their thoughts, their one word here, it'll start to populate up on the screen here live. So thank you for those that are participating as well. We thought we'd let this run here for a few seconds, because really tonight is about understanding a lot about Malden's transit systems, from bikeability, walkability, bus and train activity. We'd love to understand really what transit means to you. And you'll see in a few minutes from all the different folks that we have from our team talking about each of those different modes of transportation is really what this evening's about. And when we close out this evening, we really want to spend some time thinking about what are some of the critical actions. And in terms of the poll that you're using, we're actually going to have you answer about 5 or 6 other polls as we go through the evening. So if you want to leave that open on your desktop or leave that open on your phone, as we follow through the different slide deck here, we're going to be able to ask you some questions from our different presenters as we go through the evening. So we're really excited about that. And it's great to see people are talking about access here, about having lots of walkability and lots of options here within the community as well. So it's great to understand really what's most important to you. So with that, Jill, let's go on to the next slide and we'll talk about really what we have in store for you for this evening as well. And a reminder, leave that open on your desktop or leave that open on your phone as well, would be great. So great. So in terms of our agenda, we have a really full agenda and we're hoping to wrap up this evening around 8 o'clock, plus or minus this evening. So I'm going to hand it off to John in a few seconds to welcome us officially here. But what you're going to hear from our team is a little bit about the study overview in terms of what the study is meant to be. And John will talk a little bit about why this is important to the city of Malden and where we are in terms of Malden's great transportation history and what it means for the future. We'll have several folks in our team talk about what it means from a market perspective. Who is the market? Who is the audience out there? We'll give you a little bit of highlights from Jill about the public survey that we've had in place, and hopefully you've had the chance to take that survey, and we'll make reference to that tonight. And then you also hear from the existing conditions from many folks on our team, understanding what is your profile right now in terms of the different modes of transportation. Jill will come at the back end of our presentation here, and she'll talk about some of our preliminary findings, and then we'll talk about some upcoming meetings and next steps. And hopefully the last half an hour or so of this meeting will be dedicated towards questions and answers and time to hear from the community. And as a reminder, when we get to the back of this, we'll have you raise your hand in the Zoom platform and we'll call upon people. And we also have the Q&A function available. So at any point in time, if you'd like to use the Q&A, we'll hold on answering those to the end of the presentation, but feel free to ask any questions at any point in time and raise your hand and we'll call upon you at the back end of this presentation. So with that, John, if you'd like to get us started and welcome folks officially and why this is such a great study for the city of Malden would be great.
Great, so thanks, Jeffrey, and hello, everyone. My name is John Alessi, and I'm the city's transportation planner in the Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development. And I'm happy to have you here tonight for the Malden Transit Action Plan's first community meeting. So this project is meant to be community driven, so providing your input tonight is essential to the project's success. So before I pass things back to the team here, I wanted to share with you a key statistic about transit in Malden. The US Census Bureau recently reported that 28% of Malden residents take public transit to get to work. So that's nearly a third of all residents and the third highest percent in Massachusetts, behind only Somerville and Boston. So this gives a clear indication of how much Malden residents use public transit. And with your help tonight, the city will learn how it should prioritize investments in its transit network for the next 10 to 15 years. So I encourage you to participate in as many ways possible and stay connected with the project as it moves forward. So to give you a little bit of the background on the study, it's going to look holistically at the multimodal transportation options in Malden, identify barriers and challenges to accessing and using transit, developing solutions to make transit more attractive and easier to use, and then mapping out the steps in an action plan to implement these solutions. And to give you an overview of some of the study's tasks. So tonight we're looking at phase 1, where since we started the project in January of this year, AECOM has been working to document existing conditions, which involves developing a community profile, doing a survey of mobility needs, and then doing an evaluation of service and infrastructure. And I won't get into the tasks for the next 2 phases, but phase 2 will be identifying potential mobility strategies and options. And then the third will be developing recommendations that will be presented in the Transit Action Plan. So again, I'm excited to have you all here tonight. Looking forward to hearing your feedback and input. And Jeffrey, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Thank you for that, John. Really appreciate it. As you can see, there's a lot of work still ahead of us, and we're really still in phase 1 about really understanding the existing conditions as well. So Jill, if you can move us on to the next slide, that would be great. And the folks that are watching here, we're going to be asking these polls, as I mentioned, throughout the evening. So we're up to our second poll here, and we'd love for you to answer this question as well. How strongly do you agree or disagree with these statements? Number 1, there are a lot of transit options available in Malden. Number 2, transit is easy to access in Malden by walking. Number 3, transit is easy to access in Malden by biking. Number 4, I could use transit for most trips I make in a day now. And the last one here, I could use transit for most trips I make in a day if there were improvements in the future. So we'd love to understand, and again, any point in time, you can actually answer these questions. You don't have to wait for us to open it up. And if for the folks that are just joining, maybe a little bit late to this presentation, if you look at the top, there is a way that you can join online or on your phone at the www.menti.com, and you can use the code at the top of your screen to be able to participate in this poll exercise. So the reason why we're doing this is not only to collect a lot of the information, but you're going to be hearing from some of our presenters who frankly are really passionate about each of these different modes of transportation. This is really, really helpful feedback to the team as well. So that's fantastic. It's great to see where people think things are successful and where we need some improvement within the city here as well. So thank you for that. And again, a reminder to leave that poll open on your desktop or on your phone. And let's keep going. So Jill, if you want to move us to the next slide, that would be great. And I'm going to welcome Patrick to our team and talk a little bit about the market analysis. Patrick?
Thanks, Jeffrey. Before I begin, can someone give me a thumbs up to confirm that my audio is working?
That's
excellent.
Great.
So yeah, so the first area we want to lead off tonight in terms of the substance of our existing conditions is a market analysis. And this really reviews a multitude of different demographics and several elements of employment information. A lot of this we pulled from the Census Bureau, and we also pulled a lot of this information from past plans. The City of Malden has done some great work over the past couple of years, and we wanted to make sure that we were building off of previous studies that have taken place. And so I'm going to walk through some of the demographics that are very relevant to tonight's meeting, and then when the report ultimately comes out, there'll be a lot more information for you to review. So with that in mind, we can advance to the next slide. The 2 graphs you see on our screen, I think really reflect some equity demographics we wanted to discuss. And one of the key things about this plan is we want to make sure it's a plan that serves all residents of Malden and all people who live and work within Malden. And so one of the things we looked at are environmental justice communities. And so the Commonwealth of Massachusetts defines an environmental justice community as a community with a certain percentage of minority residents, a certain percentage of residents who have a limited English-speaking background, and a certain percentage of residents with a low-income background. And within the City of Malden, like other places in the area, you see a variety of these demographics showing up. And so nearly every census block group within Malden has a minority community, which is excellent. It's showing that Malden's a place where people can build lives. And relative to the full population, you see almost half of Malden's population identifies as a minority. Thinking about English-speaking or limited English-speaking populations, you see that there are several census block groups that have limited English-speaking populations, meaning that as we think about this plan in the future, we'll need to account for the needs of people who maybe aren't as fluent with English. And lastly, there are census block groups with low income populations within Malden. And I think this one really ties to the second graph on the screen, which you see is the median housing price. Transit is inexorably linked with housing prices. I think in order for someone to be able to get to where they need to live, they need to be able to afford somewhere to start their journey or finish their journey. And Malden, like many other places, is changing a lot. Shifting demographics are taking place. And as you can see on the screen here, the price within Malden for a single family home is quite high. And it's continuously, trends are showing that this number is continuing to grow. And there's a affordability issue at times where some individuals within Malden might not be able to afford the homes that are also available in Malden. And how this relates to transit is mobility is related to that where you live. And so being able to have affordable access to transportation allows an individual to reduce the burden of other expenses such as homes. And with that, Jeffrey, you can advance, or Jill, you can advance to the next slide. Another element of the market analysis we looked at, in addition to several other demographic trends, are employment trends within the region. Malden's very unique in that it has a large central business district, but it's also very close to Boston and other communities within the area. And when you look at census data that shows where people who live in Malden are commuting to for work, Boston is the #1 employer of Malden-based employees, as you can see on the screen. Roughly 11,500 people commute to Boston on a given day. But interestingly, Malden's the second largest employer. And you see that Cambridge and Somerville and Medford are similar. But what you really, generally speaking, you see Boston's a very large employer. And then there's a long tail of subtle tapering down of employers. But needless to say, outside of Malden and Boston, you see Cambridge as your third largest employer. And when you look on the graph on the right, you see the job density. And so a lot of the jobs based in Malden are really concentrated around Malden Center, which for many people who've lived in Malden or who've been to Malden before, that may not come as a surprise. And in addition to the Malden Center area, you do see a distribution of employment places throughout. And then you even start to see them as you go south towards some of the neighboring communities. So as we think about where transit's going, you can see that it's roughly following the commuter rail and the Orange Line, but there's also many bus routes that are serving these employment centers. And so as we sort of advance this plan, these are the type of things we're going to consider in future recommendations and evaluations.
Great.
And you can go ahead and advance the slide.
Great, thank you for that, Patrick. And I think, Jill, you're up next. If you give us some of the highlights of the public survey. And for those that haven't taken it, it would be great to get your input over the next couple of weeks. So, Jill?
Thanks, Jeffrey. Yes, so we do have a public survey open. It's the link will be shared later on. It's also on the city's website, and it's on SurveyMonkey. And hopefully you've seen postcards and flyers around town and social media blasts about it as well. So to date, as of about 10:30 this morning, we have 961 responses, so almost to 1,000, which is really exciting. You'll see here also that the survey is available in 7 different languages, and that we can also track how many folks in each language are responding to the survey. So you see that we have the highest percentages of non-English folks responding to the simplified Chinese survey, as well as the Spanish survey. So those are the higher percentages. And of course, that does match with some of the distribution of the different languages spoken within the city, but we will continue to try to reach out to the different communities and limited English proficiency communities to make sure that we're hearing from as many folks as possible. And of course, if folks have suggestions with community groups or other ways to get to populations with limited English proficiency to ask about transit, we'd love to hear it. And we will open up for verbal questions later on in the presentation. So to date, as I mentioned, we have 761 responses. We are focused here on showing you some of the questions, the responses relating to looking at the future and where folks would like to see improvements with transit service and access to transit services in Malden. And we also we'll couple that with what we're seeing in the technical analysis that we'll jump into after we discuss these give you a quick update, I guess, really, on the survey results. As Patrick mentioned, there's a lot of information that'll come out in the report, even more detailed than what we were showing you here tonight. And the same deal goes with the survey. There's a lot more information to share once we close the survey, which is open through June 6th. So we asked folks about where they'd like to see bus improvements. And you'll see that the responses with the purple stars are the ones that have more than 75% of the response and totaling over 100 responses individually. So you'll see here folks are letting us know that later evening service, more weekend service, more direct buses, more frequent bus service are high on people's list of transit needs. And then buses that run on time and follow their posted schedule are also, really high on folks' priority list. Also, we asked a similar question related to the commuter rail and the T, and that was similar. Purple star means the same thing, more than 75%. Would use transit more and over 100 responses in total. So more frequent service on the weekends in particular, more affordable fares we heard for the train services, easier transfers between buses and trains, later service into the evening, similar to the buses, more reliable train service, again, similar to what we were hearing on the buses, and then less expensive parking, cheaper parking as well, are things that we heard from folks so far about the commuter rail and T improvements and what folks would like to see. And then moving on to the pedestrian and bike improvements, really everything that we'll do tonight will kind of split into three modes: bus, train, and bike ped. So this is really just the start of how the times that we break it into the three different areas. So for the pedestrian and bike improvements, what we've heard most is new on and off street connections to bike paths and trails. And of course, you guys have the access to the Northern Strand trail system in Malden. And Jeffrey and I, maybe folks who were there, maybe you folks saw Jeffrey and I out there today handing out postcards, and John and Patrick were at Malden Center. So hopefully some of you saw us out there today and decided to tune in tonight to hear what this study's all about. So with that said, we'll actually jump right into existing conditions. If just let you know, Jeffrey, I'll just keep hopping. We don't have a poll right here, but we will have more. And what we wanted to do, as I mentioned, is talk through the different modes of transportation, being bus, train, in which case for train, we're lumping Orange Line and commuter rail together, and then also lumping together pedestrian and bike access. However, we will talk about, because pedestrian and bike access is quite different. So we will actually talk about those separately as well. Oops, I keep forgetting I need to use the arrow. So for the bus service, this is a lot of information on a single slide. What we're showing here is how frequently the bus routes operate within the city of Malden. And the chart on the left shows each of the bus routes down the left-hand side, and then the color coding shows by time of day, early morning, mid-morning, midday, afternoon, late afternoon, evening, late night, when the buses are, how frequently the buses are operating during those time periods. So the orange and green and light blue colors are more frequent service, 15 minutes or less, 16 to 19 minutes, or 20 to 29 minutes. So under a half an hour are those colors. You have a bus very frequently at those times. And then as the colors get towards the darker blue, towards navy blue category, the buses become less frequently in those periods. So you see the midday periods, for example, is more than an hour. And this is for weekdays. And of course, the frequency of the buses is also less frequent on the weekends and Sundays in particular as well. As folks who live in Malden and use the bus know well, and throughout the MBTA service area as well. On the right-hand side of the screen here is a map that shows how frequently buses are operating in a corridor. So there might be multiple bus routes operating on different segments throughout the city, and they actually improve the effective frequency, how frequently a bus comes along a corridor. So if you're only operating or needing to go from one end to the other in a corridor, and there are multiple bus routes that you could use to get for that smaller segment, then the bus comes more quickly than if you have to wait for your single route to come. So you can see here, Center Street, Florence Street, Salem Street really have the higher frequencies from a corridor perspective. Then moving forward, we also looked at ridership activity. We are going to show here the 2019, so pre-pandemic ridership activity at the stop level. And we will talk about the pandemic impact on the next slide. So from a ridership perspective, the blue colors on the map on the left-hand side show an intensity from lower ridership in the lighter colors to higher ridership in the darker colors. So you see around Malden Center and around Oak Grove, as well as some other areas along Center and Salem Street and over at Linden Square, where there are higher intensities of ridership usage. But you also see it along several other corridors throughout the city. And the red dots, red orangish dots, the larger and darker the color of the dot, the more activity that occurs at that stop. So you'll see that Malden Center and Oak Grove, of course, have the most activity as well. So it's, and that's in the morning peak period. Then looking on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the ridership by time of day information. So you can see that a lot of folks are riding during the morning and afternoon peak periods, but really quite a few are also riding throughout the midday. And that was even before the pandemic. One of the biggest things we've noticed from pandemic impacts is that more folks are riding midday and there's not as many peaks, but that was already starting to occur and become a pattern here in Malden even before the pandemic. And I think Jeffrey and I would say that we observed that at Linden Square today, where actually the ridership activity picked up after the peak period and heading into the midday period. So from a pandemic impacts standpoint, we did look at the change in ridership for all of the routes that serve Malden from 2019 to 2021. And you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, the red is a ridership decline, and the green and the amount of the decline or increase, and the green is the increase, and again the amount of the increase. And you'll see that Route 137 actually saw an increase in ridership over the pandemic, while most all the other routes experienced a decline. But you'll see that there are several routes that have now bounced back and are, when we're considering bouncing back, being generally above 80% of pre-pandemic levels. And these numbers are from 2021, and they've just increased since 2021, largely. So we are looking at looking at the route level changes. So you can see that the routes really had a great variation of how ridership was impacted by the pandemic, depending on where the route runs, how frequently it runs, and how long it runs on any given day. So you can see that there were variations in the amount of impact from the pandemic. And also notable, and this is notable in Malden, but it's also becoming a national trend as well, and that is that the weekend ridership had less of a decline than the weekday ridership, which does make some sense with more folks working from home as well. So those are some findings from the pandemic ridership changes that have happened between 2019 and now. So here we are with another poll, Jeffrey.
Great. So if folks want to join in again and find your phone or find that other window on your desktop here as well. And for some folks that have joined, I've seen a few more have joined. If you look at the link at the top here, that's at the www.menti.com, and use the code that you see up on the top of the screen, you can join in on the poll. And at any point in time, you can answer this question again. So in terms of what we just heard from Jill, what is the biggest challenge using or accessing the bus in Malden? Love to hear your thoughts about that. Either one word or multiple words would be great. And like we showed you in that first word cloud, would love to get some feedback about really what do you see as the biggest challenge about accessing the bus in Malden, so we can really help Jill out in understanding how to make improvements throughout the city as well. So some of the frequencies, the reliability, those are some of the things that we actually heard in some of the preliminary results from the survey that we had out there as well. The night service, that's another one that we talked about in terms of the community having some preference in terms of more night service as well. Great. And folks can continue on filling this in, I believe, as we go through here as well. So why don't we go on to the next topic? And I think, Jill, you're going to continue on here with some of the commuter rail service and some of the train service as well.
Yes, yes. So like the bus, we did look also at the commuter rail and the Orange Line. So this first slide here shows information about the commuter rail. The most up-to-date information available for the commuter rail service was from 2018. So that is what we are showing here. And it does, the charts do show a kind of a preference or leaning towards peak period ridership, which makes sense for a commuter rail system, with folks generally using that type of service during the peak periods to get to and from work. 147 boardings daily, primarily again in the peak period, and of course we can look in more detail as well, but Malden Center being Malden Center being the only place to access. Then, of course, on the right-hand side as well, you can see the headways, or the time between trips. Same word for buses and for train. The amount of time or the frequency of service. You can see that the peak service on the Orange Line is 7 to 9 minutes between trains, and the off-peak service being 10 to 14 minutes between trains. And you'll see the chart that, of course, that commuter rail service is less frequent, and really focused on the commuter time of day, and certainly much more frequent on the weekdays for commuting than on the weekends. So then moving forward to the Orange Line, you can see on the charts on the right-hand side of the screen, again, this information is from 2019, and we'll talk about the differences between the pre-pandemic and current figures as well here. You can see that the ridership definitely had a very peaked difference. So showing the peak ridership occurring in the morning and afternoon peak periods of the day, but with some really pretty high midday ridership, especially at Malden Center, less so in Oak Grove. And you can see that the ridership levels at Malden Center much higher, almost double that of Oak Grove. From a regional standpoint, the Orange Line stations, looking at Malden Center or Malden Center and Oak Grove together, they make up about 10% of all Orange Line ridership. So they're really busy stations within the larger region and within the larger network. And Malden Center is the 6th busiest Orange Line station. So it gets a lot of activity. Also, as I mentioned, we want to consider this information in the context of the pandemic as well. So Right now, the orange line is at 39% of pre-pandemic levels on weekdays and 70 to 75% of pre-pandemic levels on weekends. So like the bus, there was a much smaller impact of the pandemic on ridership on weekends as compared to weekdays. Again, with shifting commute patterns and times and work from home as well, definitely impacting these ridership numbers. And there was a lower impact due to the pandemic at Malden Center as compared to Oak Grove, and a lot more folks are driving to Oak Grove than they are to Malden Center, which definitely correlates to the folks who are working the more traditional 9-to-5 office jobs that ended up a lot of working from home. So those are kind of the trends we're seeing from the train perspective. And we have another question for folks.
Great. So again, a reminder that you can find the link at the top here in terms of where you need to join online and the code that you need to put in here as well. Or again, same thing with your phones. So in terms of some of the rail related and the train related information that Jill just shared, what is the biggest challenge using or accessing the T or the commuter rail in Malden? We'd love to get your feedback about some of the issues around the T or some of the commuter rail access and some of those challenges. So again, any point in time, you can put in your answers. Same thing as before. These are words. So not enough bike lanes to be maybe to be able to get there. A lot of our team has actually spent quality time in the field together, walking around a lot of these stations, and have seen some of these issues firsthand. And it's very helpful for us to understand what some of your concerns are and issues are. So safety, scheduling limits, as I see up here as well, virus concerns, especially with the pandemic and using these types of public facilities as well. So this is super helpful. Why don't we give this another few seconds before we jump on to the next one, and if folks can give us a few more words here, I think that would be great. And we can come back to some of these answers, especially during the Q&A and some of the audio that we're going to have at the back end of the presentation, so folks can elaborate on some of the thoughts they put here as well. So this is great, super helpful for the team. So Jill, I think you got a lot in front of you that you can now respond to as well, right? Great. So let's close this one out here, and we'll go on to the next topic just to keep on going through the different modes. And I believe, Natalie, we're going to invite you to the conversation. Let's talk about pedestrian access.
Thanks. So as we saw in some of the answers from the previous question, part of thinking about access to transit is thinking about pedestrian access in terms of making it safe to cross the street and walk on roadways, on sidewalks in order to walk to a transit stop or station. And so on this slide on the left, we just have some overall statistics that we've gone through a bit before in terms of Malden having a pretty high percentage of residents who commute by transit. 94% of residents live within a fourth of a mile of a bus stop, which is considered a walkable distance to a bus stop. And then 72% of Malden roadways have sidewalks on at least one side of the street. So this is telling us that there's a lot of opportunity to increase the number of people taking transit by improving the pedestrian facilities around transit stops and stations. And so this map on the slide is providing an overview of the roadway network and the sidewalks on the roadways colored by the different sidewalk widths. And so the segments in red, which you can see are only pretty short, small segments of the network, are areas where the sidewalk is missing or less than 4 feet. And we look at 4 feet as a threshold because that's what's considered an acceptable width to provide an accessible path of travel to transit. So really, we can see the majority of the roadways in Malden have sidewalks, and they have sidewalks that are over 4 feet, which we see in the blue colors. So the light blue color is showing us sidewalks that are at least 4 feet on both sides, and then the darker blue, which you can see along Center Street and on a portion of Broadway on the top right, have sidewalks that are even over 8 feet wide. And so that gives us even more opportunity to consider things like transit amenities that might fit on the sidewalk to help incentivize the use of transit. So if we go to the next slide, we looked at the 3 transit hubs in Malden in a bit more detail in terms of the sidewalks surrounding them. So within a fourth of a mile of Malden Center Station, see 93%, so almost all of the roads have sidewalks on at least one side of the street, and 69% of those could be considered accessible with a width of at least 4 feet. And then around Oak Grove on the next slide. Slightly lower percentage, but still vast majority of roadways have sidewalk on at least one side, and 64% of those are at least 4 feet wide. And then lastly, in Linden Square, 83% of roads have sidewalk on at least one side, 77% of which are accessible. So overall, what this is showing us is that pedestrian access to transit in Malden is not so much about whether or not a sidewalk exists on the street, but what the condition of the sidewalk is in terms of width and other factors. So if we go to the next slide, here you can see a sampling of different types of sidewalk conditions that we look for when we evaluate pedestrian networks. So for example, a good sidewalk would be considered Washington Street outside of Oak Grove. It's a clear level surface, free of obstructions. Someone could easily access the ramp and the crosswalk to get from the station to a bus stop across the street, or if they took the bus in one direction and were coming back on their return trip, could easily walk across and access bus stops in both directions. So that's why providing connections to pedestrian crossings is important for transit access. And then in the middle here, we see an example of a fair sidewalk at Malden Center Station, where the sidewalk is pretty clear and level on the right side, but then on the left side, there's a lot of cracking and uneven pavement. So that would pose accessibility concerns. And then on the right, on Wesley Street in Linden Square, there's a poor sidewalk. The utility pole is right in the middle. So there's no 4-foot path of travel provided on the sidewalk to access the bus stop, which is behind the viewpoint of this photo. And then there's also ponding and drainage issues on the sidewalk here, which leads to a poor, difficult to maneuver sidewalk condition. So next I'm going to talk about bike access, which was also brought up in the last question with, thinking about needing to have bicycle facilities to help facilitate access to transit. And so as expected, there's less current infrastructure for bikes than there is for pedestrians in the city. Providing bike lanes is relatively newer. But overall, we see that there are 10 miles of existing bike facilities in the citywide network. So that comprises 6% of the roadways. You can see in the map here, the existing bike facilities on street are really centered around downtown Malden, providing access to Malden Center Station. They're generally running in an east-west direction. And then there's also the Northern Strand Community Bike Trail, which is running generally east-west through the city in the dark green color. And so that's providing direct access to Linden Square bus stops. Then also has some connectivity to Malden Center. But overall, there is room to improve connectivity for bicycling throughout the city to different neighborhoods, especially north-south connections, and looking up towards Oak Grove to expand connectivity there. We can see with some of the percentages on the left that within a 4 mile of Malden Center, only 18% of roadways have bicycle facilities, although that's the highest percentage of all these three areas. Oak Grove, only 8% of roadways have bicycle facilities. And then when looking at bus stops citywide, only 8% are adjacent to bike facilities. So by looking at bicycling as a network and how connections to transit can be facilitated, there's opportunity to increase the number of people who may be using transit. So we go to the next slide. This shows a sampling of the different types of facilities in the city. There really is a wide range of on-street facilities. At the top left, we can see share markings, which is where bikes share the road with vehicles. Then in the center of the top row, there's the marked on-street bike lane on Center Street, and then the bus bike lane on Florence Street. So buses and bikes are sharing that lane. On the bottom row on Exchange Street, we see a buffered bike lane that has parking as the separation between the bike lane and traffic. Then a two-way buffer bike lane on Willow Street, and a contraflow bike lane on Dartmouth Street, which allows bikes to travel in the opposite direction of general traffic, which can help provide a more direct connection for bicyclists. If we go to the next slide, so you can see there's a variety of facilities. And so we need to think about what people these facilities are catering to, because a facility might provide a connection, but it might not provide a connection for all types of people. So in order to try to evaluate that, we look at a metric called the level of traffic stress. And so that evaluates different types of bicycle facilities based on how close they are with vehicular traffic, or whether there's separation, whether there is on-street parking on a roadway, or the traffic speed. So essentially how much conflict or stress a bicyclist might be experiencing. So if you go to the next slide, so you see here depictions of different types of people or users that might be expected on these facilities. So a low stress facility would be the Northern Strand Bike Trail, which is completely separated from traffic, so low conflict area, and that would be suitable for all ages and abilities. So something like that would be thought to provide the most access to transit, because you're providing a facility for the most amount of users. Then a medium level of stress would be something like a buffered bike lane, where there is some distance from the adjacent traffic, but you're still riding on street. And so that's more for intermediate cyclists. Then a high level of traffic stress would be a bike lane on the road without any buffer or separation. And so only the most experienced cyclists might feel comfortable there. And so, for example, if that provides a connection to Malden Center, let's say, it's providing a connection for some bikers, but potentially not all bikers to access that station. So if we go to the next slide, the final topic I'm going to discuss as part of this is bike parking, because part of accessing transit by bike is having the ability to park your bike somewhere. Some people might choose to take a bike on a bus with them, but if not, then there needs to be safe and secure bike parking, especially for people who might be commuting and leaving their bike unattended for long periods of the day. So we did an evaluation of the bike parking available at the 3 transit hubs in Malden. So at Malden Center, we see a variety of parking where there's the typical bike racks in the front, which are very visible and easy to use, but might not be suitable for people leaving their bikes for the whole day, who might want something more secure. So at the back of the station, there are the pedal and park bike racks, which provide that security. And on the next slide, similarly at Oak Grove, there's the more typical visible bike racks, as well as the secure pedal park facility. And then last, at Linden Square, there's actually only a small bike rack here on the sidewalk. So that's an area to think about potential to expand bike parking to help incentivize using the bus service there, as the Northern Strand Trail is running right by the bus stops. So having more bike parking might help people use the bus more easily. So that is the information I'll conclude this section with, and then I think we'll go to another polling question.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Natalie. And as you can see, there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to bikes and pedestrians, and where the facilities are and the classifications, as Natalie went through. So it'd be interesting for the community to reflect upon what's working and where you might need some improvement throughout the city as well. So again, a reminder to be able to join online, the website is at the top of the screen here, the www.mbta.com, and remember to use the code as well. So our next question here is, where do you experience the biggest barrier to accessing transit? So where are the biggest barriers for you to be able to accept really the accessibility of getting into the transit facilities here as well? And what's interesting about this is the one where you can place some dots on the map here. So as you're seeing some of these dots show up here, if you can zoom in a little bit and try to get as close as you can, it'd be great to understand where some of these accessibility issues are for transit. This would be really helpful for the team in understanding where some of those barriers are, and maybe they turn those into some actions that we can improve some of the accessibility around these different stations, whether it be about bike, about pedestrians, about walkability and so forth. This is really kind of helpful. So let's intentionally let this sit for another 20 to 30 seconds here to fill this up. And if you don't have the chance to put your dot on the screen, it'd be great to talk about that during the Q&A, because understanding where some of the highest issues are, and really where some of the successes could be coming out of this plan would really be helpful in terms of giving us some really clear action as well. So this is super helpful as well. Great. So we can see there's some obviously clustered around Malden Center. It's helpful to see that there's some that are further afield. So maybe there's some specific issues that might be happening in some of the neighborhoods as well. and that we understand that accessibility may vary dramatically, as Natalie went through her slides, understanding where some of those sidewalks are, the percentage of them, the accessibility is really important. And I think lastly, before we go to the next slide, just a reminder for folks to put their questions into the Q&A. Would it be helpful? I know we've been answering a few of those as we've gone through this evening. And for those that are raising their hands, just a reminder on that we will actually, in about 15 minutes, be coming to answering some of those live questions as well, just so folks know what to expect. So let's go on to the next slide here, Jill, and let's talk about, I think Mike and Patrick are going to tag team on this a little bit from the traffic perspective as well. So I think, Mike, this is off to you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you, everyone, for your great input there. A lot of great information here. So when we talk about traffic, we wanted to really establish some foundational information about safety, because you just heard about the existing pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, the importance of that connection between the transit service and the pedestrian and bicycle accessibility. And hand in hand with accessibility is safety. And so we wanted to look at crash data throughout Malden for all modes, not just vehicular modes, specifically pedestrian crash data, bicycle crash data, and vehicular crash data. And the reason we want to look at this is because as we're thinking about improvements and how we can improve accessibility, important context to that is, are there any underlying safety issues? Where are there currently safety issues? And so what you see here on this map are the 3 different modes and a history of crashes. Starting with the red colored bubbles, those are pedestrian crashes. And those would be clusters of areas where there is a history of pedestrian crashes. The darker red would be the higher instances. The lighter pink would be still notable, but lesser instances. The red plus signs you see on the map are the history of bicycle crashes in this area. And of note here, you can see also the yellow underlying line running through this map are the existing Mbta bus routes. And so something that we note here is the confluence of Mbta bus routes and areas where there are a history of bicycle crashes as well. And so what we aim to do with this data is to help it inform our process of developing improvements. And so where these crash histories overlap with existing transit services is important as we start to think about how we can improve those services. And then lastly, I'd like to point out that this is not an exclusive list of where we would be focused on safety. Everywhere where we would look to improve accessibility, safety will be an underlying objective that needs to be achieved by any infrastructure improvement. But this is really sort of foundational information that we can use going forward to inform that process. Next slide. So in addition to safety, we also want to look at the traffic volumes that are using the roads. And currently, obviously, a large portion of the roadways are dedicated to serving vehicular traffic. And so naturally, we want to understand where are those vehicle volumes greatest. And you can see here on this map, the darker reddish orange colors are roadways that have the highest daily traffic volume. And this is an average volume over the course of a year for the most recent 2021 data. And so you can see the key corridors where there's significant volumes of traffic along Eastern Ave, Bedford Street, Pleasant Street, Main Street, your main corridors that also coincidentally overlap quite frequently with bus routes. And so going forward, when we're thinking about how to potentially better serve bus routes and bus priority, this data will be really informative to help us craft bus priority opportunities to bring to you all for further consideration. And so with that, and looking at this traffic volume, I'd like to hand it over to Patrick to talk a little bit about travel trends in the area.
Thanks, Mike. So I think the AADT slide we just saw is a nice transition into this. And so we understand the corridors where this traffic is taking place, and using a software that collects data from phones throughout the world, we're able to pinpoint specific mobility patterns within Malden. And so when we think about those thousands of trips that are taking place, when we look at the types of trips people in Malden are taking, it's pretty consistent in terms of trips that start in Malden and go elsewhere, and trips that end in Malden from somewhere else. And the primary form of trips that we're seeing occur within Malden are trips to one's home. And so what you see on the screen here for both the origins and the destinations of Malden, the home trips are anytime an individual, in the case of origins, starts a trip from their home, that's an example. And anytime an individual ends a trip at their home, that's another example. And so we're seeing those are the largest trips, which presumably would make sense given that individuals obviously spend a lot of time where they live. If we think about other big trip generators, work trips are definitely a large trip generator. Interestingly, in 2022, we're seeing that of individuals who start their trip in Malden, the second most common trip type is a shopping trip. And shopping can be a variety of things, whether it's going to the store to buy flowers or groceries or what have you. But that's a emerging trend we're seeing elsewhere too, is this increase in more of your recreational style of trips. I know earlier there was a question, we're seeing some questions in the chats about students. And so we're seeing there's roughly 9,500 to 9,700 school trips a day occur within Malden. And similarly, you're seeing your food trips or your restaurants, that's hovering pretty consistently. But I think the big thing to note is that the second most popular trip occurring within Malden is that sort of shopping-based trip. And this is as of May 16th, 2022. And so it's a relatively recent assessment. And yes. And so one of the things we think about is when individuals are in traffic on these different roads and when individuals are taking these different types of trips, we're able to look at the type of mode an individual is using. And so of the trips that occur within Malden, the most common method one uses to take a trip is to drive. You see similarly, both trips that begin in Malden and trips that end in Malden, roughly 102,000 trips take place via a vehicle. But there is some distribution amongst other things. You see that a shared car, and that's not ride sharing, that's more an individual who is carpooling or who's riding with someone else. That's another example of a type of trip that's taking place. And that occurs at a similar rate to those who walk places. And so given that Malden has such a dense downtown core, a lot of these walking trips make sense. But there's this coupled with some of our discussions earlier about the pedestrian access in the community. 30,000 trips a day implies that there's an opportunity to improve this pedestrian experience. And I think you could apply this similarly to some of the other modes you see on this screen. But I think a key takeaway is driving is the most popular trip, but there is a substantive amount of other forms of sustainable transportation taking place within the community. You can go ahead and advance the show.
Great. So thank you for that, Patrick, and Mike as well. That's, again, another different perspective to bring to the conversation this evening as well. So here is one of our last polls before we get to wrapping up some of our preliminary observations. This question here is, are there other locations of safety concern? So maybe areas that we haven't talked about tonight that really want to jump out. Mike showed that really telling map about some of the big safety concerns in the red that showed up there as well. So are there other locations where you have safety concerns that our team should be looking at closely here as well? Similar to the last exercise, you can go in here and you can place your dot on the screen at any point in time and be able to contribute that way. And some of these places may warrant another look. And Mike can compare it to the maps that he showed earlier to see if the community is agreeing with some of those hotspots that are here within the community as well. And I think what's important about all the things that you've heard to date, and Jill's going to kind of pivot the conversation here in a minute, is that we've talked a lot about these different perspectives, from bikes to buses, to trains, to vehicles, from safety concerns, access concerns. All of those things are really important in terms of understanding the transit action plan that our team is going to generate over the next few months. Jill will share in a few minutes some of the schedule as we move forward, but we really wanted to spend this evening arming the community with a lot of the information that we've learned so far to make sure not only we're on the right track, but understand how you can help us really prioritize where some of these actions could be. So these additional safety concerns will be equally helpful to Mike and to Patrick as well. So thank you for those. Great. I think so. Let's go on to the next slide, Jill, if we can here, would be great. So now we're going to pivot, as I mentioned. So with all the great information in mind, and this is what the team has been doing for the last couple of months here, we've already started to formulate some preliminary observations that we'd love to share with you to see if we're on the right track about where we could potentially affect change from the transportation perspective. So Jill, back over to you about some of these preliminary observations. I think around 3 of the priority areas that we've started to look at as well.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Jeffrey. So we'll look at Malden Center, Oak Grove, and Linden Square again. We haven't forgotten about the rest of the city also, but this is where a lot of the activity is happening. So this is where we're concentrating some of our preliminary efforts. So the next 3 slides are very, very detailed maps. And I know you probably won't be able to take it all in because there's so much going on in them. But what we wanted to do was really zoom in on those 3 areas, again, Malden Center, Oak Grove, and Linden Square, and look at the different types of the different modes and the different concerns and the different opportunities that we're seeing. So the notations in green have to do with concerns about bike or pedestrian access. The blue have to do with bus operational concerns. The yellow are just to note there are high ridership stop locations, so we need to be aware of that. The blue, I'm losing my colors. The purple is the infrastructure concerns that we've seen, and also that Natalie mentioned a bit in her conversation. The orange would be traffic and safety that Mike and Patrick talked about. And then the white are wayfinding and bus stop amenity concerns. And we did see that the group here tonight did note amenities as being a concern as well in one of our earlier questions from polling. So you can see here at Malden Center that we are looking at a lot going on. There's a lot of bus routes that come into this area. There's obviously commuter rail as well as Orange Line. There's a bicycle infrastructure with the pedal and park. There's bus lanes. The bus lane ends out front on Commercial Street. There are a variety of conditions of sidewalks and crosswalks in this area. And there is the surface lot behind the station that has folks crisscrossing across it, which obviously can be have some safety concerns. And then out front with the 7 bus bays and folks trying to access the station and the buses going in and out, some of the buses have to come out and take an immediate left after they've come out onto Commercial Street to get onto Center. And that can be very challenging in that very short distance. You can see it's really just a tree's distance even in the graphic. So you can see that there are some challenges here at Malden Center that we've observed, and we're looking into. The next step over the next few months, as Jeffrey mentioned, will be to look at developing possible solutions to some of these challenges that we've identified both from our analysis as well as what you share with us here tonight, what we learned from the survey, and what we learned from talking to folks across the city. Also, moving forward into Oak Grove, again, same color scheme. So the different colors of the commentary have to do with the different types of observations. So you can see there's a lot of surface parking, as you probably all know, at Oak Grove, 729 spaces in total across the entire area. There's also ongoing construction they're going on right now. And on the west side of the station, there's a lot of new, some of the construction's complete now, and there's a lot of new sidewalks and new access points. And then on the east side, there is a pedestrian connection to the neighborhood, and the greenway ends at that point in time. So there is access from both of the neighborhoods to the area. But as you can see from the image, and if you've experienced it yourself, it's a bit longer distance to actually get to the station and to the bus stop. And you'll see that there's only a couple of bus bays here as compared to Malden Center, that has a lot more bus bays. And then finally, at Linden Square, we are, again, same color scheme, looking at a lot of different things going on there. You have the Northern Strand coming in. There are 6 bus routes stopping at a few different stop locations, 7 in total, out in front of that municipal lot where Jeffrey and I were standing this morning and talking to folks. There's a lot going on from a traffic standpoint. Certainly the traffic backs up along Lynn Street and along Wesley Street, particularly in the peak periods, makes it challenging for the buses to move in and out of traffic safely. And as the blue note mentioned in the center, that's every 4 minutes a bus is arriving in the peak period. And then on Wesley Street, that's every 5 minutes. So that's a lot of buses, a lot of people, and a lot of walkers and bikers in the area. Some of the area of here is newer construction and in good condition, and then other infrastructure is older and in not as good condition. So we're looking at a whole variety of things going on here, and we're looking at a whole variety of different aspects of transit and transit access across the city. So with that, those are some of the things that we've been observing so far, and we will continue with those, and we'll augment that our findings and our understanding based on what you're able to share with us. And so we're almost to the point where we're opening up the mics, but back to you, Jeffrey.
Great, excellent. So this is maybe Jill, you could help me out with this one here as well. But again, as a reminder, if you're looking for how to join us, the menti.com, and use the code up at the top here as well. But this one was really about what are your top 3 priorities for improving transit in Malden? So it would be great to start the conversation with understanding where maybe some of the communities really some of their preferences are. So at any point in time, you can pick some of these as well. But maybe a little bit about why we pick these would be helpful in terms of orient people, like what some of these choices really mean and why.
Sure, yeah, definitely. So the question comes up like a little checkbox on your screen, and you can check up to 3. You don't have to select 3. You can just select 1 if you'd like and hit submit. So these options have been driven to some extent by the survey results that we've received to date, and so we're helping to validate some of the survey results that we've been seeing, and also mixed in with the findings that we have from our technical analysis so far, and what possible solutions might look like from an improvement perspective. So we're kind of looking at it from both different ways, and so you can
Great.
see more frequent service is up there at the top.
Great. And what's helpful about asking these questions early is you can imagine when we're done in several months and have a lot of actions for John and for the city and for the state to move forward with, there's going to be no shortage of things that you could do. So how do you start thinking about prioritizing some of these things, and the ones that are highly actionable, highly fundable, and be able to move things forward that really mean a lot to the community as well? So this early input is super helpful to us. And as Jill mentions, it validates some of the things that we were starting to think about as well. So super helpful on that front. So I think let's close this one out, Jill, and move on here as well. That'd be great. So we'd love to open it up for the community to have discussion. And thanks for bearing with us over the last about an hour there. But we really felt it was important as a team, and working really carefully with the committee as well. It's been a great resource just to arm folks with as much information as possible to make this next half an hour or so really meaningful and giving us further feedback from you as well. So the way that this will work, if you can raise your hand in the Zoom platform, there should be a dashboard either on the top or the bottom of your screen. It'll look like a hand symbol. What we'll do is we are going to do a little bit of tag teaming amongst our team here as well and invite people to answer some of the questions. Also a reminder, if we can maybe focus on the Q&A function versus the chat. Jill's going to be helping us monitor the Q&A and we'll answer some of those. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back and forth for the next half an hour or so and to be able to answer your questions. Love to hear your comments. And what I'm going to do is I'll read off your name if you raise your hand. I'll invite you to come off of mute on the Zoom platform. When you get that little invitation, you can accept it on your end. You'll join us on audio. We can have a little bit of a conversation. I'll put you back on mute and we'll go back onto the next person and so forth. So maybe while we're waiting for folks to get lined up with the Q&A as well as raising the hands, John, it would be great to maybe to get a little bit of a soundbite from you here about, you've been working with the team over the last couple of months and you've seen a lot of this getting together. So any initial reactions about some of those preliminary observations that the team has made and kind of what does this mean for you in terms of our next steps as we go from existing conditions into alternatives in the next few months?
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Jeffrey, and everyone on the team. I think all these findings are fantastic. I think it provides great insights into the state of public transit in Malden because just like that statistic I mentioned at the beginning, almost a third of residents rely on public transit to get around. One of the things I'm really excited for is to hear from residents here tonight, look more in depth into the responses from the survey to figure out what are these little things that the city doesn't know about. And, I know that the team here has done their preliminary observations of Malden Center, Oak Grove, Linden Square, but I'm really looking forward to hearing about these. What are some of the smaller things that we need to hear from residents about and how do we incorporate that into the next stages of the project? So really looking forward to hearing from residents tonight and yeah. Great,
excellent. Yeah, I know from the get-go, we've talked about highly actionable things as well. So I know that's really important to the city. So great. So I see we got a couple of questions I think have come in. And Jill, if you can monitor the chat as well as the Q&A. And let's go. And I think, Jill, if you could help me with on and off microphone here would be great. And then we're going to invite Martha to join the conversation. If you want to hover over her name.
You have the reins.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you for all of this. It's totally fascinating. Thanks for your work. I really appreciate it. And I have a question about something you may not have any, you probably don't have any control over yourselves, but part of the danger, I think, to both, the huge part of the danger to both pedestrians and bikers is not just the volume of traffic, but the style of traffic, the speeding, it's really kind of terrifying. And is there thought being given to, does the police department, for example, have the capacity to do anything about that? Or has there been any thought to putting in more actual red lights, stop lights, rather than those pedestrian blinking yellow lights? I don't know if that's within your purview, but it's the speeding issue is horrendous, and it keeps me from biking the way I would like to.
Great. Well, thank you for that question. It's a great observation as well. And maybe I can invite Mike to join in on this one because part of the analysis that Mike did, while we could look at the different transit modes, he intends to look at some of the traffic as an indicator to tell us what that means for some of the people using these transit facilities. So Mike, what was your observation about all those red squares that you saw up on those maps?
Right. Yeah. And so I think that the key here will be as we start to look at improvements and really dig into the location specifically, all of that crash data that I shared earlier on that map, while it's just presented at a high level, has a lot of underlying information that we can drill down into. And so when we start to look at crash histories in a specific location, we can start to see contributing factors that are recorded in the crash data. So we'll start to see things like speeding, for example, as a contributing factor that gets recorded. And so we can start to catalog and understand what are the underlying issues and really factor that into crafting improvements to transit, to accessibility to transit, to help address those safety concerns. And so the great thing is that the information is there, and we really will be leveraging it as we continue to progress this project.
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Martha. Really appreciate it. And I'm glad you're seeing the importance of relating traffic and safety to folks as well. Did you have a follow-up question on that, Martha, as well?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's the biggest streets, of course, people go the fastest, obviously, but even some of the smaller streets are terrifying. And I just put in the chat, I live on Franklin Street, and people drive down Franklin as if they're driving down Route 60, you know. So speed bumps, stoplights, turning two-way streets into one-way streets might help. I don't know, but it would be something to that effect would be very helpful. I do have another question on a different topic, but maybe someone else needs to take a turn.
Well, why don't you, once you get that one in, and after this question, we'll go on to the next person, since we have
Okay.
microphone.
Again, it may not be within your purview, but the fair share amendment, I believe, would put, if it's passed, if people vote yes on it, it would put a lot of money into education and transportation. Are people that you work with and you all expecting that to pass, or hoping it will pass, or advocating for it? Because this must be very expensive to do any of this, any improvements.
That's right. Yeah, very expensive. It will depend on the type of intervention that we've been talking about tonight. You know, doing a couple of curb cuts and accessibility at locations might be relatively cheap, but adding more buses and buying those facilities and rethinking the drop-off pickup for things around the downtown might be something very different as well. So I'm looking at my colleagues. I'm not as familiar with the piece of the funding that's in place that you're talking about. I'm not sure if John or if Jill might know some answers to that. But clearly funding these items and having a strategy to implement a lot of these things over time, there'll be multiple funds, and how they get allocated will be really important. John?
Right.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. And Martha, I want to thank you for your question. And I have to be honest, I had to Google search right now the Fair Share Amendment because I wasn't familiar with it. Looking at a general look, you know, I'm not really sure like how those funds would be dispersed if it were passed. But one thing I know right now is that with the federal infrastructure bill that was passed, there's a lot of money that's going to be going from the federal government to the states. And Massachusetts Department of Transportation is going to be looking at its 365 cities and towns for implementing a lot of these changes. So in addition to whatever comes out of this Fair Share Amendment, there's also going to be a lot of money available soon. I'm not sure how that's going to look, but that's why I think that this transit action plan is very important, because once that money becomes available and MassDOT figures out how they want to disperse this money, whether giving it directly to municipalities or creating new discretionary grant programs, we'll have a plan in place to say, yes, this is what the priority is, and this is how much it is, and this is what we want to implement. So we're looking at, you know, all different types of avenues through which we can gain funding for these projects.
Great, thank you for that, John. Let me go on over to Jill if you want to see if anyone's put anything into the Q&A or to the chat, and maybe we can reread what the question was or what some of the answers were. It might be good to highlight one or two of those, Jill.
Sure, yes. Councillor Winslow did ask a question. Do the survey results indicate any particular comments from non-English speakers? And that's a great question. We have not done that analysis yet, because it requires us to untangle the responses from the 7 languages. And so we'll wait until the survey closes on June 6th. But that is one aspect of the survey analysis that we are going to do, is to look at any differences in the types of responses and response patterns based on the language of the response.
Great. Was that the only question that we had in so far, Jill, or were there others that have come in? And if not, that was only.
I'll just say one more. Yes, there is a link on the final page of the survey, and it is on the city's website. but it's surveymonkey.com/r/Malden Tap, and I'll put it in the chat as well. But
Great.
go ahead, Jeffrey.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And then what Jill and I are going to do is intentionally go back and forth between the Q&A as well as people that want to come off microphone. So let's go to Finn. Finn, I'm going to invite you to the conversation.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Two quick points I wanted to raise as someone who bikes around Malden. One is it's been really, really exciting to see all the ways that Malden has started making it more accessible and inviting. It feels like a lot of new lanes have gone up really quickly. There's lots of different types. It makes me feel a lot safer around Malden Center. So it's great. I think more people should actually know about what Malden is doing and be celebrating it. It's kind of flying under the radar, but it does feel a little bit like the intersections that are right around Malden Center. Those are like literally accessing the station. If I have to like make a turn through an intersection, I find it really uncomfortable and kind of scary and unclear sometimes what I'm supposed to do. I'm never sure if like if the signals there are the type of signals that detect people on bikes or not. So I just, maybe more focus on the intersections like right around the station. And then the second comment I wanted to make was more for my wife. Oak Grove, the connection between the Oak Grove bike cage and the Spot Pond Greenway is like awful. There's like no way to get from the cage to the Greenway directly. And when my wife has the kids on her bike, she has to like go up and over curbs, and there's no curb cuts there. Accessing the Greenway, John, maybe if you know how that's laid out there, you have to like make a really sharp turn up a hill there. So it doesn't seem like honestly that Oak Grove is integrated into the Spot Pond Brook Greenway. So in terms of just like areas of the city where people are having trouble, I just wanted to highlight that as a challenge. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Finn, too. So two really good comments on that as well. I appreciate that. And I think what we can do is maybe let's go to Natalie to talk about, she shared a great graphic that shows the different facilities from a bike and walkability perspective. And what was telling to me is that there's such a diverse range of bike facilities throughout the community. And I think you picked up on a pretty good point, John, that as you get closer to the heart of downtown, how do those facilities deal with a lot more busy traffic and some of those connectivity? So maybe Natalie, just a soundbite on some of the range of facilities and why they're important and what that might mean for the downtown in particular.
Yeah, I think bringing up the intersections around Malden Center is a good point because, I talked about the different types of on-street bike facilities and then providing different levels of comfort or stress for different types of riders based on the level of separation from traffic. But equally important is thinking about bike facilities through an intersection because it isn't right if you get to the intersection, but then there's no way to adequately get through the intersection or turn in one direction or the other. That can be a really big barrier to the overall bike network and being able to access your final destination, such as Malden Center. So I think that's definitely something that we have observed so far and we'll look more into as the study progresses.
Awesome. And Jill, I know the team, we've walked around Oak Grove and we've seen buses come in and go out and those critical connections through the parking lots and so forth. So I think we've seen some of those issues firsthand. So that's super helpful to know where those concerns are, especially if you have kids that you're having on your bike and things like that as well. So thank you for that, Finn. Appreciate it as well. So let's see, anyone else raise their hand? So let's go over to Rachel, if you'd like to join the conversation. And Rachel, you have to look for.
Hear me?
Yes, Rachel, how are you? Yes, welcome.
Yeah, hi. I'm curious. I looked at your survey and I was listening to your presentation and there were some things there that I found very odd. Like your survey has actually lumped a parking and drop off and pickup into the same question. Would you prefer parking and drop off pickup? You have to approve the same thing. Now, clearly those are two separate things. Dropping off and picking up and parking are two very different things. So there's a defect, and that was just one of the things I saw on your survey. The other problem is I'm using a smartphone, okay, and it's not the latest model smartphone. So you guys have shown a number of slide decks with writing on them that are so small that like they're the size of a pinhead. So how do I actually see those in real time to actually be able to make comments here? The other concern that I have is that you've defined disabled accessibility as having a sidewalk on one side of the street. So do you guys, how do you guys propose to accommodate disabled, slow-moving people who may need to actually jaywalk to get to that one side of the street? I really don't understand how you define that as accessible. None of this makes a whole lot of sense.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you for the comments, Rachel. Really appreciate them, as all of them as well. Yeah, so I think to answer the last question about the sidewalks, maybe Natalie, I can get you back into the conversation here as well. But I think the point is that we have spent some time as a team trying to, benchmark where you are today, having to make a series of baseline conditions assessments. So, maybe the thought of having just one side as part of the equation about the percentages you talked about, Natalie, maybe we can go back and revisit that a little bit. But these are just early indicators about how we can start to characterize the neighborhood as well. So maybe we can start with that one, Natalie, in terms of like the sidewalks, one side versus two, people having to cross the street to get to the sidewalk. A great point that Rachel mentions there.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, definitely accessibility is about more than just a sidewalk width. First of all, as we talked about, you could have a sidewalk of 4 feet wide, but if there is an obstruction like a utility pole, fire hydrant, just even general debris that might fall into the sidewalk, that could pose accessibility issues. So the data presented today was a more high level overview of generally what we're seeing using mainly GIS, geographic information systems data at a high level to just get an overall understanding of citywide conditions of the sidewalk network. And so we used the 4 foot width of sidewalks as a benchmark to understand sidewalks that likely would have an accessible width in terms of how ADA defines an accessible path of travel, which is at least 4 feet clear width. And so the map shown with the blue sidewalks was showing where both sides of the street are likely 4 foot width sidewalks, not just one. However, if a roadway did have a 4 foot wide sidewalk on only one side of the street, you're right in that there would also need to be an accessible crossing to connect the closest sidewalk on the other side of the street to provide that accessibility from one side of the street to the other. So it would not be considered accessible if there were a sidewalk on one side and not an accessible pedestrian crossing connecting to it.
Great, thank you for that, Rachel. Appreciate the clarification. And in terms of the technology you mentioned, Rachel, I'm sorry that you don't have a bigger screen, but one piece of advice might be actually trying to use your fingers to zoom in and out of those. I know it's not ideal, but also know that we're going to be posting this on the city's website in terms of the recording. So another way is if you'd like to watch us, and I know it's not real time, but it might give you access to some of those graphics. And I think we could probably give some contact information to get in contact with John at the end of this too. So apologies for that, but that might be one technique they could use for this evening as well. And lastly, about the survey, like we hear you about putting answers to questions that might bundle things together. As we go through and build surveys like this, sometimes we need to be a little bit efficient about the number of choices and answers, but we hear you drop off, pick up, parking. They clearly are different operations, and our apologies for bundling maybe too many of those together. But we can look a little bit more carefully about those, because you're right. The operations about where you park versus where you drop off are clearly different. So I appreciate your feedback on that as well. Really do. So Jill, let's go back over to you, see if anyone else has joined in on the Q&A and if there's any questions that we'd like to go through. And a reminder to folks, if you want to raise your hand, if you want to raise your hand again, we'd love to come back to you on audio as well. But Jill, back to you. Any people in the Q&A?
Sure, yes. We have a question from Gary Chin. Are there opportunities to protect bike lanes in Malden or to implement other traffic calming measures?
Excellent. So I think, I'm assuming the answer is probably yes, but let's see, maybe Natalie, do you want to join us in on that one too? That'd be great. Again, back to that chart that you showed us about the different type of facilities. So how are they protected in some locations as well?
Mhm. Yeah, I guess the general answer to your question is we would, and then as the study moves forward, look at those opportunities for providing more protected bicycle facilities or identifying priority locations for them to best connect to transit in Malden, whether that's the stations or bus stops. So essentially, I'd say yes, we're going to look into that as we continue. And you're right in that providing a separated bike facility that takes up more space along the roadway would also contribute to traffic calming and slowing down traffic speeds, which would help increase the level of comfort experienced on that facility. So it's kind of serving two purposes at once.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, I think one of the challenges in being in an urban setting like Malden's downtown, for example, the width of the right of way and the cross section and allocating that precious space for some of those protecting barriers and so forth. You know, is there enough room to be able to fit those in? It might be yes in some locations and no in others. And how do you balance the equation around mobility, safety, and access in these things? I think will be something that our whole team needs to look at to understand what you could do and so forth. And maybe to Mike's point earlier, maybe working with the police department, understanding some of the things around safety and speed and intersection tweaks. Maybe there's some opportunities there to retrofit things as well. So great questions. Really appreciate them as well. So let's see. Let me, Jill, was there another question that we had in terms of the Q&A, just to make sure we touch space on that?
I think we have one hand raised.
Okay, great. So no more in the Q&A, just so I understand. Or the chat.
Not that I see right now.
Okay, great. Excellent. Excellent.
I'm a little slow.
No worries. So Martha, I'm going to invite you to rejoin the conversation. So.
Hello again. Someone else first asked in the chat, I believe, about Route 1 is very important to Malden people because there's so much shopping on it. Are there any plans or would it be possible to run more buses up and down Route 1? Or is that just such a car place that it would be impossible to do it? It would be very useful if there was more public transits to different points on Route 1.
Great feedback. So, you know, Jill, I'm not sure if you have any specific answer to that one too, but I think if that's a thought our team can take a look into, you know, does it make sense to run more buses in that area, given the ridership, given the frequencies that are out there and the headways that are out there today, and given the use of those sites in terms of where people are seeking to get access to. So that's something that we can look into as well.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, I'd also like to add that you know, within our study right here, feedback like this is obviously really helpful. But Martha, just to let you know, with this plan, we're kind of prioritizing you know, things that the city can implement itself. But I'm going to touch upon this later. The MBTA is going through a bus network redesign project right now, where they have, they've released the map right now. And I'm going to talk about another Malden community meeting where you can provide feedback to the city that can then be relayed to the MBTA. But I really encourage you through the MBTA itself to provide feedback like that, in addition to providing it here, because both are inherently, you know, intertwined. The Transit Action Plan and the bus network redesign. So, so thank you for the comment here, and I encourage you to make feedback to the MBTA as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Martha. Appreciate that as well. And let's go back to Rachel. Welcome back to the conversation, Rachel.
Yeah, hi. Based on what I've heard on your presentation and what I saw on your survey, it looks like almost all the data that you're using is based on data during a time of COVID. And you're using this as preliminary data to extrapolate, to build further surveys. Frankly, this doesn't make a lot of sense because we all know this has been a special period. You know, this is like asking, you know, kids in a cafeteria whether or not they want cake. I mean, clearly it seems like the data is going to be skewed from the very beginning.
Great. Thank you for that. Well, I would sign up for the cake too if that was being offered. But I totally hear you. So let's go back, Jill, because I think that's a really great question about the data here as well.
Sure.
And understanding that this is not the only study, as well as community, that's grappling with what happens with the data pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID. But I know, Jill, you had a couple of slides that talked about how you're seeing some of those changes in percentages up and percentages down. And it's not a foregone conclusion that during COVID is the only answer. I think our team's going to be much more dynamic in thinking about both aspects. So maybe, Jill, if you talk a little bit about that, would be great.
Sure. Yeah, we were actually really cautious about collecting pre-pandemic data, which we were looking at was 2018 and 2019, and then looking at that compared to 2021, which is really still COVID, and then comparing that as well with 2022 information as things continue and we transition from pandemic to endemic slowly. But we, all of the things where we're looking at numbers, we're using the pre-pandemic numbers to understand volumes, assuming that those will come back and grow. So we're not, we think it's really important to look at patterns and how things changed during COVID and how things are coming back and at what pace coming out of the pandemic. But from a volume or numeric standpoint, where we'll certainly look at pre-pandemic numbers.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That was a great question because sometimes people may assume one thing or the other. So thanks for the clarification on that, Jill. Really appreciate it. And just to check the Q&A or the chat, is there anything else that we want to be monitoring there too, or are the questions tapering off?
Just one more thing there, and then if you wouldn't mind remaking me the host, and we'll share our last couple slides. Councillor Winslow asked about talking about the role of the Safe and Sustainable Transportation Committee, or the Sustainable and Equitable Transportation Committee for Malden, the SETC. The many members are here today, and thank you for joining us. They have been really pivotal in guiding this process, and John meets with them monthly, and they are able to help provide us feedback on materials and give us guidance, and have been enormously helpful in the technical work, in getting the word out about our various activities and providing us guidance. So I think it's great to thank them, and I'm sure John will as well in his closing remarks.
Great.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Jill, that the Sustainable and Equitable Transportation Committee has been great. For people who don't know, that's a committee out of the city that includes myself, 4 residents, and then Councillor Stephen Winslow. So, you know, throughout the entire process of the Transit Action Plan, the team here has been looking to the committee for feedback and providing kind of like the first round of resident feedback on a lot of their results, analyses, and just any information that they're presenting. So the committee's been very involved in this project, and they're going to continue to be, even with the bus network redesign, how the city provides comments to the MBTA.
Great. And I think, Jill, another question came in. If you want to monitor that one, then let's go to the few folks that have raised their hand, and then we'll probably pivot back over to let you present some of the schedule and stuff that's coming next. So if you want to look through the Q&A, and there's a question that came in, I think, about cars and having enough room for bike lanes. Yeah.
Oh, good question. I didn't scroll down far enough. The last question here is there consideration to make sure there is enough room for cars to not be too close to bike lanes? In some places, cars will practically and inevitably get really close. For example, like at the intersection of Florence Street and Main Street.
So again, great observation, and our team is listening carefully here in the background to understand some of those concerns. Obviously, make enough room for the bikes, for the walkers, but also for the cars. And I talked about that cross section of a road, how much width is given to each of those really important users to make sure they're meeting the right type of standards and so forth. So that's a very important comment as well. So thank you for that, and we'll be looking to that as well. So let me go back to Martha and invite you to join the conversation, and then Rachel, and then I'll hand it back over to you, Jill, to talk about some of our scheduling. So Martha, welcome back.
Hi, thanks again.
Yeah.
From what I've heard, in terms of the question earlier about pre-pandemic stats versus pandemic stats, and then what happens in the future, I have heard, and please correct me, you all are probably much more up on this than I am, but it seems like national trends are that there is going to be a lot more work from home than there was pre-pandemic. That trend is going to stay, maybe not in quite as heavily as it was during the worst parts of the pandemic, but apparently more and more people are going to be working from home, and I would presume this would make transit projections focused as maybe somewhat a bit less on commuter, commute to work issues, and more on shopping, entertainment, socialization, trips, that kind of stuff. Is that true, or am I off base there?
That's a great question. And if you had the crystal ball and can answer that for all of us, I think that would be wonderful.
Don't you have one? That's what I'm here for.
Okay. Yeah. So let me hand that over to Patrick, because Patrick, I think, had some really interesting graphics about what was happening there, and maybe talk about some of the market trends and what we're seeing in the future. Patrick?
Certainly, yeah. I'm happy to talk about that. And I think you're spot on in that obviously we're still in a pandemic and we're still figuring out what the future is going to hold. But some of those emerging trends are that I think it's going to be very industry. We're seeing it very industry by industry specific. There are many individuals who throughout the pandemic have still had to come to work and have still relied on the transit service to get there. But there are also plenty of people who have been able to work from home, whether it's 5 days a week or whether it's 2 days a week. And we are starting to see that. I think, without getting too statistical, we're starting to see that curve emerge with the distribution of different work from home options showing up. And I think you raised a really good point that while there might be this decrease in the emphasis on work trips and the needs of a commuter, there's an increase now in the needs of the person who's going shopping or the person who's traveling on the weekend. I think one of the big takeaways I've received from some of the feedback, both in the chat and in the survey, is this increased need for weekend service, and late night service, which obviously there are many service workers who also need that weekend and late night service to get to and from work. But there's this larger demand now for people that say, hey, I don't want to drive. I want to try and be sustainable, or I can't afford to drive. And so I think you're definitely spot on that an emerging trend is that while we both still need to make sure we're addressing the needs of that commuting force, it's also that we need to reevaluate how we address the existing and future needs of the non-workforce, I guess we should say, or the non-work-based trips, we should say. So I think your comment's very much in line with the trends I've seen in research anyways.
Yeah, and Patrick, it might be that in a study like this coming out of the pandemic, that maybe there's a little bit of a monitoring aspect of an early action item that says, like, hey, let's monitor things for a couple of years, see if those trends actually come to fruition. And based on those, maybe there's the ability to rethink some of the implementation steps in terms of priorities based on what those trends really unfold. So maybe our team can think about that as well.
Certainly. And what I would add too is, in some of this will be in the report, but some of the existing conditions we're identifying when we looked at travel trends using our data, we didn't just look at that Monday to Friday trip. We realized that, hey, we're seeing that people are traveling on the weekends now. So when we look at our data, we need to incorporate those weekend trips into our analysis. So I definitely feel like the analysis I'm doing today is very different than the analysis I was doing 18 months ago. Not in Malden, obviously, but generally, I think reevaluating how we gather our data is definitely something that's emerging as a result of this.
Great. Thank you for that. And Martha, I just want to make sure that we captured your question there as well. So if you'd like to finish up on any other question you had there. I saw your hand was still raised. Just want to make sure.
I'm sorry. I should lower my hand.
That's okay.
Yes, you did capture it. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
It is important. I do hope that our non-work lives will be taken as seriously as our work lives,
Yes. Excellent. No, thank you. Really appreciate the question. All right, so Jill, I'm going to hand this back over to you if you'd like to represent the screen here and talk a little bit about next steps and what's forecasted so that we can maybe then hand it over to John to close us out for the evening.
Definitely. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for participating tonight and providing such excellent conversation and feedback. From a next steps standpoint and a schedule standpoint, as I mentioned up front, the survey will be live through June 6th. There is a QR code for the survey here. There's also a link, surveymonkey.com/r/Malden Tap. It's also in the chat as well, for folks to use the link, and also available on the city's website. So our next steps are to conduct additional community engagement. We want to make sure that we're collecting information and feedback from all the different areas within the community. So we're going to regroup after what we've heard and over the last few days and through the survey, make sure that we're giving everybody a chance to provide feedback and conduct additional engagement as appropriate based on what we discover from what we've seen to date. We'll summarize those engagement findings and integrate them into our technical preliminary findings that we shared here today, and then use both of those pieces together to identify potential mobility strategies. And then we'll bring those strategies back out to meet with the community again in October. And so we'll meet after that, we'll meet with the community one more time, I think in the December timeframe as well, just to give you an idea. There'll be 2 more community meetings. And so I'll hand it over to John.
Great, thanks, Jill. So actually, can you advance to the next slide, Jill, as well? Great. So before we wrap up, everyone, I just want to say thank you for joining tonight. Feedback like this is extremely essential, as we wrap up this first part of the project, the existing conditions analysis. I really encourage you to continue participating in this project because, like I mentioned before, a third of all the residents really rely on transit. So this is an extremely important project for supporting Malden's residents. And if you haven't completed the survey, I really encourage you to do that, share with your friends, because like I mentioned before as well, just knowing these little things that we haven't picked up on is going to be important as we start doing our serious planning later on. So I want to thank the team at AECOM, McMahon, the Sustainable and Equitable Transportation Committee for joining today and presenting all this information. And the final thing before wrapping up I want to talk about is that the city is going to be hosting a community meeting regarding the Mbta bus changes, otherwise known as the bus network redesign. So the purpose of the meeting is to learn about the network changes in Malden and then to be able to provide feedback to the city. So we'll go in depth with a lot of the changes, the trade-offs between coverage throughout the city versus the increases in frequency. So if you are kind of confused about this process, you want to learn more, you want to ask questions, I'm going to be leading a panel along with members of the Sustainable and Equitable Transportation Committee to learn about these changes and to have a community discussion. And that will determine how the city of Malden officially provides feedback to the MBTA. So if you want to take part in this, it's June 23rd from 6 to 8 p.m. You'll be in person at City Hall in the council chambers, or you can participate through Zoom like we're doing today. And those meeting details will be posted on the city's website soon. So in addition to the Transit Action Plan, please continue participating in projects like this because, the city of Malden really needs to know what improvements and changes it needs to make based on your feedback. And it's incredibly important. So thank you everyone for coming tonight, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation as we move forward.
So with that, I think we're going to close out for this evening. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and looking forward to seeing you at the next one.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.